Thank you. I want to thank you for inviting me here this evening. It is a little unusual for me to come and speak on history because I'm an archaeologist and an anthropologist. I'm not a historian. I briefly ventured into writing history a number of years ago when, in order to aggravate Shaker scholars, I put together a total bogus history of a group of Shakers that moved to Alabama to raise watermelons, and I passed that off as a legitimate work. But I've matured well beyond that, and I want to assure you that the majority of what you'll hear this evening is factual, and I will attempt not to tell you more than I know. My involvement with McClure occurred here in New Harmony several years ago on a cold January afternoon when Don Pitzer, the Professor Emeritus, University of Southern Indiana, I think everyone knows him, the author of the definitive work now, New Harmony Then and Now. We were having lunch in the Yellow Tavern and discussing the notable people who had been here at New Harmony, and we decided that maybe if we took the quotes from their writings, it would help shed light on their ideas and philosophies. And so Don said, well, why don't you do McClure, and you can start with his newspaper, The Disseminator. Now, I'm going to refer to it as The Disseminator because very few people can remember the entire name of this publication. The Disseminator of Useful Knowledge, containing hints to the youth of the United States. See, it's not just Indiana, the whole United States. And then from the School of Industry, and then with the quote, ignorance is the fruitful cause of human misery. So you'll excuse me if this evening I just call it The Disseminator. Well, when I started this, I knew a little bit about McClure, but I thought, well, I ought to read some books and find out something about his life history, so I'll give you a thumbnail bio of McClure. This is a very small thumbnail, by the way. McClure was born in Scotland in 1863, a large family, and he was the son of a merchant. He was educated in the public schools, and at that time it was part of, I'm sure, what was considered a classical education. McClure excelled in mathematics and in the sciences, but he had no time at all for histories of Greece, Rome, and Latin, which he saw that he had no use for, which kind of sets the tone of McClure's philosophy that education should have a practical side. It should have some value, as you said, to erasing human misery. He followed in his father's footsteps as a merchant. He was extremely successful. He started trading companies in the United States and Canada. And he seemed to have spent the first 30-some years of his life devoted to making money, which he did. And he acquired considerable wealth. And it's my opinion that the reason McClure really accumulated wealth was so he could do what he really wanted to do, and that was be a geologist. And he does spend the first 2 decades of the 19th century traveling broadly through. He goes throughout Europe. He goes into Russia. He comes into the Americas. He works in the West Indies, collecting rock samples, collecting mineral samples, studying the stratigraphy, and becoming a noted geologist, to the extent that he was elected president of the Academy of Natural Sciences and the American Geological Society. I think it is during his travels, you can begin to see that his travels are where he begins to lay the foundation for another aspect of his life, and that is as an educational and political reformer. And he writes extensively on these 2 subjects. I think his political leanings maybe can be traced back to his time when he was born. He lived through such a amount of political unrest. He was a teenager during the American Revolution. He lived in Paris during the French Revolution. He was in Ireland when the Irish revolted against the English rule. And he actually resided in Spain when they had a revolution that resulted in his property being confiscated. So you can see his history in these things kind of folding into his political philosophy. I think that we are most familiar with Robert McClure because he was of his meeting Owen, of his organizing the boatload of knowledge, coming to New Harmony. He founded his newspaper. There was already a newspaper here when he came, the New Harmony Gazette, but you can kind of tell from McClure. McClure had to have his own paper to describe his own views. The Working Men's Institute, and of course his estate in endowing libraries. When he came to New Harmony, his health was not the best, and so he spent a lot of time living in his residence east of Mexico City. And it's from his residence in Mexico City that he writes letters which he sends back to New Harmony and are put in the newspaper. And I'm going to leave it to someone else. I find it interesting how you can write letters in Mexico in the 1820s and ship them. How do they get to New Harmony? That was, I think our postal system was founded in 1847, and he's sending stuff out in 1820s. In reading his letters from Mexico, I've come to the conclusion that we can also give McClure another title, which I don't think anyone has, and that he's also an anthropologist. So I will touch on that somewhat later. Finally, he does die in Mexico at the age of 76 in 1840. So I've put together a summary of the people of William McClure's many faces. Successful businessman, highly qualified scientist and geologist, anthropologist, and a political and educational reformer. To the working man, McClure was a champion, but to the establishment, he was a flaming radical. Before getting to his thing on education, let's go back and I'll touch briefly on my anthropological side of McClure. Of course, many people traveling in the early 1800s, 1700s, throughout that period were writing journals, were keeping diaries, and their descriptions of Native American cultures are excellent. An anthropologist who describes the culture of a people is called an ethnographer. And many of these early travelers gave us excellent ethnographies, descriptions of Native American cultures. But I think McClure takes it to a slightly higher level. Anthropology as a discipline, one of the founding dates that's used is 1892 because that was the first year it appeared as a separate item in the Encyclopedia Britannica. McClure is writing in the 1820s. I'm going to give you two examples of McClure as an anthropologist. 1956, an anthropologist at the University of Chicago is studying the peoples of Mexico and Central America. And he says that the native cultures there are really just small societies living within a big society. And he terms this the big tradition and the little tradition. The big tradition is the dominant European societies, which are controlling the economic, the political, the social, and the religious systems. And the little tradition are the Native American cultures. And he points out that the Native American cultures are retaining their own culture but adding to it bits from the European culture. And he says they're actually a half society, half traditional and half European. No one had really said this, But let me read you what McClure writes in 1828 about the natives and Catholicism. They don't appear to be very bigoted to all the ceremonies of the Catholic religion. And the Indians mix the ceremonies of their dancing and of their ancient worship with the processions of the Catholic faith, retaining a sufficient respect for their ancient religion to prevent their new faith from taking roots. So McClure says that in 1828. An anthropologist makes his name for himself by saying that in 1956. One of the core principles of anthropology is that when you study a culture, you must evaluate it in terms of the people practicing that culture and not from the point of view of your culture. To use your culture as a standard is called being ethnocentric. Viewing it from within the point of view of the people practicing that culture, we call that cultural relativity. McClure really understood cultural relativity. In his political essay number 20, he makes the following statement. We measure others' wheat by our own bushel. In matters of opinion, it is the only measure we have access to or the capacity of which we are acquainted with. The fault that creates so many disputes and broils is the false assumption that our bushel is the standards. The Lutherans, Presbyterians, Quakers, Catholics, etc., all have their different bushels. The monarchists, Democrats, aristocrats, etc., have their different bushels. Every trade and profession have their bushels, all of whom attempt to measure others by their own and insist that theirs is the only true standard. This is the origin of all intolerance and persecution. I don't know it. I'm telling you more than I know. That may be one of the earliest statements of cultural relativity that exists. We'll now look at his newspaper, The Disseminator. As I started reading books, I would go to the bibliographies and look up Disseminator. Sometimes it was there, but usually people were only saying that McClure founded a newspaper called The Disseminator of Useful Knowledge. It seems logical that if you start a newspaper that has the term useful knowledge in it, the contents of that paper would contain what McClure thought was useful knowledge. I called the Working Men's Institute and I asked if any of the McClure scholars had ever done a table of contents of any issue of the Disseminator. And they said to their knowledge, one had not been done.